My husband disappeared, abandoning our daughter to have a child with another woman, but now he's back asking me to help him with his son because they've been abandoned. It's been a wild month, and I don't even know where to begin untangling all of this. I guess the beginning is as good a place as any. It all started 2 years ago. My husband of several years, whom I'll call Dan, disappeared from our life without a trace. Just like that, one Tuesday afternoon he vanished. No note, no argument, no sign that he was about to leave. One day we were a family, and the next, he was gone. That moment still haunts me. It was devastating. I didn't know what to do. And worst of all, I had no idea what had happened. I came home from work, made dinner, and went about my usual tasks, expecting him to arrive. I called him, but all calls went to voicemail. The messages didn't go through. His last social media activity had been 12 hours earlier. I panicked. I called his job, and they said he hadn't shown up that day. I called his friends and family, but no one knew anything about his whereabouts. I was terrified, but I gave myself false hope, thinking maybe his phone was off and that he'd come back that night or the next day. That morning never came. My parents and his came to support me because I was shattered. I had a 5-year-old daughter and didn't know how to hold myself together. After waiting a day, we filed a missing persons report, and the police showed us images of accident victims from the past 48 hours. Still, no signs of him. Then, 2 or 3 days later, I got a call from the police. They had found a man's body in an abandoned mill. It was an unclaimed body, and the build matched Dan's description. The face was slightly disfigured due to decomposition, and they called me to identify if it was Dan. It still gives me chills every time I think about that day. My parents took me to the morgue, and I just remember praying so hard that it wouldn't be his body. My prayers were answered. It wasn't Dan. Those days were very hard for me, and I almost neglected my daughter. I became obsessed with searching for Dan. Fortunately, my parents took care of her. From tirelessly posting on social media, asking everyone to contact me if they found any clue about Dan, to printing missing person posters and distributing them all over town, I did everything. His parents also ran around searching for him. They contacted distant relatives in other parts of the country to see if Dan had reached out to them. They got in touch with everyone, from his school friends to his neighbors, but still nothing. My mind filled with negative thoughts. What if he had an accident? What if he died? Could he have been kidnapped? Was he the victim of a crime? The idea of him abandoning me was the last thing on my mind. You know, when these things happen, people sympathize with you to your face, but behind your back, they start questioning your behavior. I often overheard comments like, "God knows what drove him to take such a drastic decision," or, "You never know what happened between them." Although none of these comments came from my loved ones or Dan's parents, it didn't matter who said them. These remarks led me to sabotage myself. I started questioning my sanity, replaying every conversation I'd had with Dan in the last few days we were together. But I had no idea what could have caused it. We hadn't even had a fight in a long time. Eventually, I lost all hope. I finally accepted the bitter reality: Dan wasn't coming back. I tried to keep everything together for my daughter's sake, but inside I was falling apart. I went back to work. My company was understanding enough to give me 2 months of leave, but after that, they gave me an ultimatum. Either I came back or resigned. Resigning wasn't an option, because now I was a single mother with a 5-year-old girl. Soon I had to leave my denial behind and accept my reality. It was hard. Life goes on, whether you're ready or not, and I had to think of my daughter. I had to be her support when I felt like I was drowning. The money in our joint account was untouched, but I realized I would have to work very hard if I wanted to give my daughter a good life. I threw myself into work and being the best mother I could be. We moved into a smaller house because the old one was too big for the 2 of us, and the memories of Dan haunted me there. My daughter missed her father. That was undeniable. But she's a strong girl, and soon she learned to live without him. There were nights when she would wake up to my crying and comfort me, saying, "Mom, I'm here with you. I'll never leave you like Dad did." Over time, we even started talking less about him. It hurt too much to keep thinking about the past, and I needed to believe that we could be happy, just the 2 of us. Then, about a year ago, Dan's parents surprised me. We had always maintained a cordial relationship before Dan's disappearance, and when the incident happened, they supported me unconditionally. They stood by my side the whole time. They visited us occasionally to check on how we were doing, but this visit was different. They were as heartbroken as I was, but there was something else. They told me they had sold some of their assets, including their property. They wanted me to have that money to raise my daughter. They were in tears, saying it was the least they could do for us. It made me cry too. Dan was their son, and God knows how they were holding on at their age. I didn't want to accept it at first, and I told them they should save it for their future, given that their son wouldn't be around to take care of them in their old age. But they insisted. They said they had insurance money and savings that would last them a lifetime. I still didn't feel right accepting it, but I was struggling financially, and my daughter's future was my priority. I accepted it more for her than for myself. That money changed our lives. I was able to buy a house, save for her college, and finally breathe without worrying if we'd make it to the end of the month. It gave us security, and I will always be grateful to them. They even told me to consider dating and remarrying, but I wasn't ready for that yet. Then, a month ago, my world turned upside down again. I was getting ready for work when I heard a knock at the door. I opened it, and there was Dan. I hugged him with all my might. I started crying and kissing him. He was saying something, but I couldn't hear it. I just kept crying and asking, "Are you okay? Are you hurt? Where were you? What happened?" That's when I saw a stroller with a baby. At first, I couldn't process it. I looked at Dan with terrified eyes and he said, "I'm sorry, please listen to me." Everything happened so fast. I panicked. My body reacted before my brain. I pushed his hand away and shut the door in his face. But he didn't leave. He kept knocking, begging me to open the door and listen to him. Eventually, I opened the door, and this time, he was holding the baby in his arms. I remember looking at that child and then back at Dan, unable to comprehend the situation. He started speaking quickly, as if he needed to get everything out before I had the chance to throw him out again. He told me he had had an affair with his assistant. The affair lasted for 2 years, after which she got pregnant. She threatened to expose them if he didn't leave me and marry her. He was a coward, unable to admit the truth or divorce me, so he chose the easier path, disappearing. They made a plan to leave the country and move to her home island. She quit her job 2 months before and left first. Later, one day, Dan also fled the country, abandoning his life, his marriage, and worst of all, our daughter. I stood there speechless as he continued talking about how it had all been a mistake. His lover soon realized she didn't want him or the baby. On the baby's first birthday, she left, abandoning Dan and their child. Her family and relatives had no idea where she had gone. In fact, they all turned against Dan, accusing him of being the reason for her disappearance. They were about to report him to the authorities, suspecting that he had played foul, but before that, he somehow escaped the country with his son. Now, he had no one to help him raise this child, and that's why he was at my door. God knows how he found my new address. I lost control. All the pain, anger, and betrayal that I had held in for 2 years came out like an avalanche. I screamed at him to leave, to get out of our lives and never come back. I told him I didn't care what had happened between him and that fool, or that now he had a motherless child. It wasn't my problem. He was no longer part of my family, and neither was that child. I slammed the door in his face, and he almost got hit by it. He still stood there, crying and begging me to forgive him. He had the audacity to say, "This is our chance to have the family we always wanted, 2 children, a girl and a boy." It's true, I did want 2 children, but that boy is not mine, and I don't want to accept him. After pleading, he started emotionally manipulating me. "How can you be so cruel to an innocent soul? What has he done to you? You claim to be a religious woman, and this is what you do to an innocent child. You're punishing him for the mistakes of his parents." He's so manipulative, I'm telling you. No, I didn't accept him or his child, but his words and the innocent cries of the child broke my heart. However, I didn't lose my resolve. I yelled at him to leave or I would call the police and sue him for neglect and abandonment of our daughter. He quickly left after that. I immediately called his parents to warn them. We all knew that after I kicked him out, he would turn to them, and that's exactly what happened. Dan went crawling back to his parents, apologizing with the same old story, begging for their support. But his parents, God bless them, had had enough. They didn't believe his apologies, not after everything he had done. They didn't want anything to do with him. And that's when things got really interesting. Dan is desperate and out of money. He asked his parents for his share of the family inheritance. Dan's grandfather had left properties, the same ones they sold to give me that sum of money. Dan had been counting on that inheritance to rebuild his life. When his parents told him the truth, that they had given the money to me for our daughter's future, Dan lost control. He went crazy, demanding how they could have been so foolish as to hand over the inheritance to me. He asked them to get the money back, but they refused. They said the money had been given to the rightful heir, which is my daughter. Having lost that battle, he came back to my door, demanding that I return the money. At first, I refused, saying that it was his parents who had given it to me for our daughter's future and that I wouldn't return it. But now he started messing with my mind, accusing me of manipulating his parents and using my daughter to exploit them financially. I am a person with dignity, and I can't tolerate those accusations. I want to throw the money in his face and get him out of our lives forever. But then I think about my reality. Securing my daughter's future is more important than proving that I'm a saint. What do you think is the best thing for me to do? Update 1. You're right, I was overthinking. Dan's parents gave me the money of their own free will. I didn't ask them for it. I know Dan and others won't believe that, but it doesn't change the truth. and I shouldn't worry about what Dan thinks of me or what he's going through. What he did was a grave sin, and he deserves what's happening to him. Can you imagine the audacity? He abandoned us for years, then showed up with a baby from an affair and asked me to raise him as my own. The worst part? He demanded the money his parents gave me to secure our daughter's future. He should be proud that his parents took responsibility for my daughter in his absence, but he only cared about his own well-being. Many of you commented, asking why I didn't report him for abandonment. Well, before he showed up, we didn't even know if he was alive. He was still on the missing person list. And when he returned, it was such a vulnerable moment for me that I could barely think straight. Also, I don't want to get into any legal trouble. I have a full-time job and a daughter to take care of. His parents already gave me what was essentially his, so I'm fine. All I want now is to protect my mental health. However, the next time he came to my door asking for his inheritance money, instead of feeling guilty, I confronted him. I haven't stolen anything or manipulated anyone. His parents took on the responsibility he abandoned. I simply threatened to call the police and have him arrested. That was the last time he showed up at my door, thank God for that. My threats didn't stop him from continuing to exploit his parents. However, after losing all hope of getting the money from me, he asked his parents to let him stay with them for a while as he got his life in order. His parents had to accept because of the baby. After all, they are his grandparents, whether they like it or not. They are good people, though I wish they would cut him off from their lives entirely. For a month, Dan and the baby stayed with them while he half-heartedly tried to find a job or decide on his next step. But, surprise, surprise, after about a month, Dan disappeared again. He simply left a letter to his parents that basically said, "Since you gave my inheritance to my daughter's future, the responsibility of raising my son is now in your hands." It was as if history was repeating itself. Only this time, it was his parents who were left with all the responsibility. They were devastated, not only by his disappearance, but also by the responsibility of raising a child they never expected or wanted to care for. I can't even describe how heartbroken his parents were. His father is over 70, and his mother is almost 65. They were crying like babies when they gave me the news. They no longer have the vitality of their son. How could they take care of a 1-year-old child, both physically and financially? They did their best to try to locate him, but as usual, with no luck. It seems Dan has mastered the art of disappearing, I suppose. I went to visit them once, and it was the first time I saw that child properly. I didn't feel hatred for that little being. In fact, I felt pity. He was abandoned, feeling unwanted by everyone. God knows how Dan's parents will raise him. The poor child is suffering because of his parents' decisions. Update 2. They say you can fool someone once, but not always. When Dan disappeared the first time, he left us full of doubts. The main one was concern, as we all worried for his safety. But when he did it a second time, we knew exactly what he had done. As I mentioned, his parents had a lot of difficulties raising his child. So they sought help from social groups and started circulating the child's picture to search for his mother in her home country. We had a feeling that she was there, and it turned out to be true. After 2 or 3 months of circulating messages on all platforms and social groups, Dan's lover appeared to take her child back. One more thing came to light. Dan never married her. According to the laws of her island, one cannot marry during pregnancy. After abandoning her child with Dan, she apparently straightened her life out and had settled in a new place, far from Dan and her chaotic past. But when she got the news that Dan had left her child at the mercy of his parents, she finally returned to take him back. But she wasn't just there to pick up the child. She also wanted to put Dan in serious trouble. She was furious that he had abandoned her child. I don't know how her anger was justified when she was the first to abandon the child with an irresponsible man. A man who disappeared from his wife and daughter's life should never have been trusted in the first place. She filed a lawsuit against Dan for negligence and abandonment, and it is said that now Dan is facing serious legal repercussions. Honestly, I can't say I'm surprised. He deserves everything that's happening to him. Since Dan had fled the responsibility of raising his son, the legal system was not going to be lenient with him. Between the lawsuit and the mess he made of his life, he was facing serious legal consequences, and this time the police managed to catch him. According to what his parents told me after receiving updates through their lawyer, Dan was charged with child abandonment and negligence. His lover's lawsuit wasn't just a slap on the wrist, it came with financial penalties, and he was ordered to pay a significant amount in child support. It wasn't just the civil case that affected him in the end. The authorities also got involved. He was facing charges for having abandoned his child and not even fulfilling the basic requirements of parenthood. These types of legal problems carry serious consequences, especially when the court sees a pattern of negligence. Since Dan had already exhausted his savings and no longer had the support of his parents, who were fed up with him, his financial situation was in ruins. There was no inheritance left to rely on, and after the court hearings, he couldn't even find a stable job. The mounting legal debts, along with the child support payments he now owed, plunged him into financial misery. As for my daughter and me, we're doing fine. My daughter doesn't even want to see her father. She has seen me cry all night, then her father show up at the door and call me all sorts of names for accepting the money. In fact, she's afraid of him. I promised her that I wouldn't let him come near us again. She has adapted to life without her father and is thriving. I'm proud of the life I've built for us, and I won't let him or his drama ruin it again. Sometimes I think about the little one, Dan's son. I think about how he was abandoned, not once but twice, by the people who were supposed to protect him. As for Dan, I don't care where he ends up, in jail, as an irresponsible father, or lost somewhere far away. He's no longer my problem. It turns out disappearing was the best thing he could have done for us. Just yesterday, I heard from someone that Dan had fled the country again. This time not out of panic over an affair, but to escape his legal responsibilities. Some say he left to avoid going to jail, disappearing before things got worse. I can't confirm for sure, but no one has seen or heard from him since the court hearings. His parents haven't spoken to him in months, and his lover is pursuing the case with the police to find his whereabouts. Somehow, Dan became the ghost he always was, disappearing without a trace, like before. But now, no one is really looking for him. His parents have moved on, and I certainly have no interest in knowing where he is. My daughter has a much better life without him, and honestly, so do I. Whatever happens to him from now on is no longer my problem. Edit, some people are asking why I haven't sued him. Well, to begin with, the money his parents left me seemed fair. Secondly, because I don't know where he is right now, so I don't know how the legal process would work in that case. Update 3. First of all, I'd like to clarify something that has been on my mind since I posted the earlier updates, the fake name I gave my ex-husband Dan, which I now regret. Several of you left comments saying do it for Dan, and I didn't understand what you meant. At first, I thought you were seriously suggesting that I give the inheritance money to my ex-husband, which seemed crazy to me. Finally, someone explained to me that it was a reference to a viral internet story, and when I read it, I found it pretty funny. However, he doesn't deserve an ounce of sympathy, not even the comic reference, although I appreciate the laugh. Now, moving on to the important stuff, I now know where Dan is and what he's been doing with his life. It turns out that after disappearing a second time and leaving his son with his parents, he escaped to Canada. Yes, that's right, Dan fled to Canada to try and escape his responsibilities. When I found out, I couldn't help but think that for someone who has run away from so many problems, he chose the wrong country to take refuge in. Why? Because Canada has agreements with the United States on child support enforcement, and that's exactly what Dan tried to avoid when he left. Remember that the mother of his child had sued him for failing to fulfill his responsibility as a father, and although at first it seemed like he might escape the legal consequences, that wasn't the case, at least not for long. Several of you recommended in the comments that I try to find out in which country Dan was and see if I had a case against him to demand child support for our daughter. Well, now I know I do. Upon discovering that he's in Canada, I decided to act quickly and file a lawsuit to make him pay the support he has never given. I'm not only suing for the years in which he hasn't contributed anything, but I'm also seeking for him to pay until our daughter turns 18. Some people ask me if I really need that money, given that my in-laws gave me a substantial sum for our daughter's future. Fortunately, we don't depend on Dan's money to survive, but that doesn't mean he can keep evading his responsibility. Besides, everything I receive from Dan's support will go into a college fund for my daughter. At least something good can come out of this mess. And my daughter will have a secure future without depending on her grandparents' generosity or the sacrifices I've made to ensure she has everything she needs. I know some of you may be thinking, but what if Dan runs away again? And believe me, I've considered that too. Dan has proven that he's more than capable of disappearing when things get tough. However, this time I think the situation is different. He now has a good job in Canada, according to what I've been told, and he's paying child support for the son he had with his ex-lover. So, although he could try to escape again, the chances of him being caught are much higher if he decides to flee to another country. I don't think he can keep running away forever. If he decides to flee again, international agreements for child support cases will make it harder for him to hide. And if he does, he'll always have to live in the shadows because the lawsuits won't disappear if he does. Update 4. The lawsuit against Dan for our daughter's child support is already underway, and although at first I didn't think it would go anywhere, he has started paying part of what he owes. He still has many payments ahead until our daughter turns 18, in addition to everything he owes from the first time he fled. But Houdini, as some call him in the comments, seems to have learned that escaping isn't a sustainable option. For now, he has agreed to pay. probably because he understands that his situation would become much more complicated if he runs away again. If I force myself to be optimistic, I'd say Dan won't disappear again. He has a new life in Canada, a stable job, and apparently he's fulfilling his obligations. However, with him, you never know. He seems to have developed a certain addiction to running away when things get tough, and although I can't control whether he does it again or not, I'd rather focus on what is within my control, taking care of my daughter. Being both mother and father to her isn't easy, but I'm determined to make up for her father's absence. She's much better off without the instability he could have caused her. Plus, she has the love and support of her grandparents, my in-laws, who have been a great source of strength for both of us. Her grandfather, in particular, has spent a lot of time with her and, in a way, has become a father figure.